Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Amplifying Voices for Youth Justice. My name is Rosalind Niemeyer. I am the Family and Caregiving Policy Associate here at the Center for Public Justice, and we are a nonpartisan Christian civic education and public policy organization based in the DC area. So today we are going to be discussing current juvenile justice legislation in DC through CPJ's framework, hearing from two of our student authors who have both written just exceptional articles on juvenile justice issues, one on public defenders for youth and the other on the use of juvenile life without parole. And at the end, we will preview some new research that the center is publishing that I am very excited about. So I'd like to start by introducing to you all three resources that we have developed as a part of this project. The first is a theological framework for juvenile justice as a Christian and family policy issue. The second, a practical application of that framework in evidence-based practices. And finally, a policy memo that analyzes current juvenile justice legislation in Congress. So at the Center for Public Justice, we're often asked why we structure our juvenile justice program within a family and caregiving policy frame instead of, say, criminal justice or children's rights program, for example. And while it does also fall into both of those areas, we do approach things a little bit differently. We know that scripture tells us that families are the most basic institutions, woven into the fabric of creation, and that the flourishing of families is critical to the flourishing of creation. As such, families have God-given responsibility and authority for children. The government should not and cannot properly fill the role of parent for a child, justice involved or otherwise. This means that children, whenever possible within the constraints of justice and safety, should not be unduly separated from their families or detained in facilities far from their community. These principles underscore the relationship between juvenile justice policies and family supportive policies that is backed by research. Measures aimed at strengthening families and improving parent-child relationships go hand in hand with efforts to address the root causes of youth crime and to support diversion and rehabilitation. Moreover, the inverse is also true, unfortunately. Children who are particularly vulnerable to unstable homes, poverty, and involvement in the child welfare system are also at an increased risk for contact with the juvenile justice system. To that end, the Center for Public Justice seeks to advance juvenile justice reforms that uplift the roles of families and preserve its unity whenever possible. We have developed our first resource that lays out this theological framework that supports our understanding of juvenile justice reform. We ground this in three key themes: the image of God, justice and mercy, and the institution of family. With these three themes in mind, we can identify the kinds of policies that do or do not uphold this biblical understanding of juvenile justice reform. The image of God, or Imago Dei, for example, means that as Christians, we need to care about the racial and socioeconomic biases that are prevalent throughout the juvenile justice system and that disadvantage young image bearers. Justice and mercy, we know through the themes of justice and mercy, we know that it is the role of government to hold juvenile offenders accountable and seek proportional punishment, called retributive justice, on behalf of the law and any victims. However, we're also called to restorative justice, allowing for successful reconciliation and rehabilitation efforts, and addressing root causes of systemic inequality that perpetuate crime and injustice. Mercy is not at the expense of pursuing justice for victims of youth crime. Rather, through a restorative policy framework, justice and mercy must go hand in hand in working to address the underlying factors that influence youth crime and provide holistic support to a vulnerable population, both for the victims and the offenders. Finally, as we've already touched on, the biblical institution of family tells us that policies must also aim to uphold the integrity and social viability of families, which don't exist in an economic, social, or political vacuum. Family unity should only be disrupted for the welfare and safety of its members. However, the unique needs, problems, and successes of each part of the juvenile justice system throughout the US can vary widely, as we all know, I'm sure. So we know that there is no one perfect policy to reform the system and uphold these three principles. However, there are a few well-established evidence-based policy solutions that I'd like to highlight that address some of these most pervasive injustices. These practical applications are the basis for our other companion resource we've developed that will also now be available for use and reference. So, some of these evidence based policies include raise the age policies, which prevents those under 18 from being charged as an adult or held in an adult prison, something that we know through evidence makes youth more vulnerable to abuse, health issues, recidivism, and bad outcomes across the board. Diversion programs are another proven method. This is grounded in research that points to the effectiveness of alternative methods to address certain juvenile offenses, such as through counseling, addiction treatment, in school discipline, community programs, or similar efforts to avoid formal court involvement in establishing a criminal record over minor offenses. Additionally, these efforts for diversion programs also represent an opportunity to preserve family unity by keeping children at home or close to home while they undergo these programs. Third, treatment oriented facilities when detention is necessary is another method. As opposed to traditional juvenile detention facilities whose focus is on punishment and crime deterrence and public safety alone, treatment focused facilities focus on those things, but also prioritize lasting behavioral change by using skill development and rehabilitation that will help youth succeed following release. So, having briefly discussed this framework that we've laid out, I'd like for us now to turn to some of the policies currently under consideration in Congress. This is the focus of our third resource that we have for you today, which takes the form of a policy memo that briefly analyzes each of the bills you see on the screen now. Despite juvenile crime rates decreasing nationally, it remains a highly polarized issue here in Washington, D.C., where crime rates, including violent youth crime, remain higher than in other cities of similar sizes, and several very public incidents have led to a lot of public discussion. Many, including some very influential officials, have voiced concerns that juvenile justice reforms are soft on crime or disregard accountability for youth who commit violent offenses, and that a more punitive approach is required to address this. So, this past fall, because DC does not lie within any state jurisdiction, Congress introduced federal legislation aimed at punitively increasing consequences for youth involved in crime. As of the time of this webinar, several of these bills listed have passed through the House and are now awaiting debate and a vote in the Senate, while another two have made their way through House committees and are on the floor calendar. And the last one has not been voted on in either chamber, excuse me. First, the DC Crimes Act. It has several aspects. It lowers the definition of youth as it is currently defined in the Youth Rehabilitation Act from 24 to under 18. It removes judicial discretion in alternative sentencing for youth of any age. It requires the Attorney General of DC to establish a public website with statistics on juvenile crime, and it makes the Attorney General of DC a presidentially appointed position instead of being appointed by the mayor, as is customary. And it also prevents the DC Council from enacting changes to existing criminal liability sentences that impact DC juvenile courts. All of this effectively limiting DC home rule and putting control at the federal level. The Youth Rehabilitation Act, originally put into law in 1985, set the age of eligibility at 24 in recognition of the continued development of our brains until that age and the increased capacity for change that still developing brains have. This bill would bump that age down to under 18. Removing all of these alternative sentencing options for youth ignores this capacity for change that has been legally recognized by the Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama in 2012. However, despite the contents of this bill, we know that DC laws are actually already very punitive towards youth. Pre-adjudication, DC youth are 50% more likely to be detained than youth nationally, and those convicted in the DC juvenile system have an incarceration rate almost 5 times as high as the national average. The next bill is the DC Juvenile Sentencing Reform Act, which lowers the age at which a minor may be tried as an adult for certain criminal offenses in DC from 16 to 14 years old, the age of the typical eighth grader or high school freshman who is now being charged as an adult and placed in adult prisons. In contrast to the aims of this bill, research shows us that youth charged as adults are actually proven more likely to reoffend than those held in the juvenile system, and they face a higher risk of sexual abuse, physical assault, and suicide while they're incarcerated. We also see very clear racial disparities in cases of adult sentencing, with Black youth being 9 times more likely than their white counterparts to be sentenced as an adult for the same crime. The third bill touches on a topic that we'll also be hearing more about in just a few minutes from one of our article authors, juvenile life without parole, which is effectively death in prison. The Strong Sentences for Safer DC Streets Act of 2025 mandates that all those charged with first-degree murder in DC be automatically sentenced to life without parole. Currently, that's the maximum sentence for adults. Mandatory minimum sentence is 30 years. This would mean that everyone convicted would automatically receive that maximum sentence regardless of any factors such as age. This also repeals provisions that prohibit sentencing minors to mandatory life imprisonment without parole, as it contradicts the US Supreme Court's decision in Miller v. Alabama. In that case, the Supreme Court recognized that constitutionally, children are different from adults for sentencing purposes, and mandatory life without parole sentences fell under the Eighth Amendment as a cruel and unusual punishment for children. The next bill, H.R. 5242, would repeal the Second Chance Amendment Act and the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which is a second look policy that allows judges to review sentences after someone has served 15 years for an offense they committed as a minor or as an emerging adult through 24 years old. The Second Chance Amendment Act also created a system for sealing and expunging certain criminal records, and that would also be ended in this new bill, applying to both juvenile and adult crimes, and effectively inhibiting restorative justice efforts for these people charged as minors. The last bill covered in our policy resource is the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This piece of legislation is the cornerstone of all juvenile justice reform policy. But without its reauthorization, which is currently pending in Congress, its funding is subject to appropriations each year, a process which is becoming more and more volatile. And it leaves policies throughout the country that are built on its precedent vulnerable to being changed. For even more detail in these bills than I've just provided, I encourage you all to check out our resources that can now be found on our website and that we'll be sharing in a follow-up email as well. While many of these particular bills only directly affect residents or youth of Washington, D.C., we know that the policy agendas in our nation's capital often signals to other states the tone for the kinds of policies that they will enact as well. Already, many juvenile justice experts have drawn a clear connection from DC to Kansas, where the Kansas State Assembly has introduced a bill that creates an effective two-strike policy, mandating incarceration for any repeat youth offender if that second offense is within a year, and it diverts funds from their evidence-based programs account to fund more beds in detention facilities. This bill in Kansas and the ones we've discussed in DC are just a few examples of the many legislative possibilities throughout the country to either reform or set back the juvenile justice system. But now that we have all of this information, what do we do with it? Well, of course, the Center for Public Justice has prepared an engagement packet to encourage you to get involved in your communities, in your states, start conversations with your neighbors and congregations, and share about what you've learned here. We'll be including the link to that in the chat as well as in the follow-up email we send. This includes ways to get involved, ways to stay connected, contact information, as well as some ready-made graphics that you can share that we hope you'll find useful of some of the more compelling statistics that we are discussing today. So now that I've talked to all of you for a good while, I'd like to transition us to the next portion of this webinar, where we will hear from two of our article authors, Kayan and Acacia, about their pieces. They are a part of a 10-part series that centers youth voices as crucial stakeholders in juvenile justice reform. We're midway through publishing this series, but both of their articles, as well as several others, are available to read on our website, and more will be coming out soon, once a week. These articles cover a range of topics that our authors are passionate about, from healthcare access for youth in detention facilities to chaplaincy services, and an interview style article that looks at the age of adult prosecution from a firsthand perspective. They're incredibly moving reads, and our authors have done a great job on them, so I encourage you to take a few moments and check them out. My colleague Mary Lauren is going to take the lead with our first author, Acacia, so I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Rosalind. Welcome, Acacia. Thank you so much for joining us. So Acacia is going to tell us a little bit about her article that's titled, "We Are Talking About Children, Overworked Public Defenders, and Youth Access to Justice." So Acacia, my first question for you is, can you tell us briefly a little bit about the topic of your article and what made you interested in writing it?
Yes. And first, I wanted to just thank the Center for Public Justice for having me speak at this webinar. And a little bit about me, I'm a graduating senior from George Washington University studying political science and psychology, and I'm pre-law. So one of the big motivations I had is just interest that I have in public interest law. And when I first heard about public defenders being so overworked that they're not able to spend adequate time on these cases, I just felt really disheartened. And then to see the connection it has and the ripple effect that it has for justice involved youth was equally disheartening. And so I decided to title my article, "We Are Talking About Children, Overworked Public Defenders, and Youth Access to Justice." And that first part, "We Are Talking About Children," actually came from an interview I was able to have in my article with Alice Wilkerson. And it's just a reminder that justice involved youth are children at the end of the day, and it really helps reframe our perspective. And it's a reminder that children make mistakes, but should still be given a chance at flourishing in life. And so some of the main points from my article that I just wanted to highlight quickly is that public defenders are so severely overburdened that some only get to average about 7 minutes per case. This leads to delays for justice involved youth, rush cases, and just honestly inconsistent legal representation for youth, as some can afford to hire outside counsel, but some have to use public defenders. Additionally, many justice involved youth lack meaningful access to counsel. Some go unrepresented or waive their rights to counsel. A statistic to highlight is that in some jurisdictions, more than half of justice involved youth appear without any legal representation, which means they have to speak for themselves before a judge, respond to legal questions, and make decisions that carry sometimes lifetime consequences. And to conclude, I conclude my article by saying that lasting change requires both public institutions and civil society. Some examples include reducing caseloads, increasing funding, and just prioritizing rehabilitation and dignity for youth.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing a little bit about yourself and then kind of providing an overview of your article. And yeah, just I think the statistic that you were talking about, how many youth show up without representation. I think I've read somewhere even having like a member of a faith community present for the youth can greatly sway and influence the judge's decision. And so, yeah, really appreciate your work in highlighting a really important facet of the issue. My next question for you is, what did you learn about the experience of writing your article, either kind of the writing process or something about the topic itself?
Yeah, so I think one of kind of the most exciting parts of writing my article was being able to conduct this interview with Alice Wilkerson. So Alice Wilkerson, she's the executive director of Advanced Maryland and the Advanced Maryland Education Fund, and her organization is a member of the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition. And so they advocate for such things as policies aimed at keeping youth out of adult court, expanding rehabilitative services, and really just centering the voices of system-involved young people and their families. And so it was through this interview that I actually learned one of the big problems for youth in Maryland is the state's practice of automatically charging many children as adults. And so I actually live in Virginia now, but Maryland's so close in the DMV, and I had no idea that this kind of law really impacts the youth in Maryland. And so Alice Wilkerson was able to shed light on that. And so just this law, coupled with how youth often have to rely on overworked attorneys, which I talk about in my article, it can really have just devastating effects as the adult court proceedings are more timely and more expensive. And so being able to conduct this interview with somebody who is really in the field and advocating, it highlighted a lot of really key important things that I was able to learn from.
Yeah, awesome. Well, my final question for you, Acacia, is what is like the most important thing you want people to take away after reading your article?
Yeah. So the big thing that I want people to take away from my article is that they can make a difference. I know we're told that so often that we can kind of be desensitized to it. But my interview with Alice really showed me how important the work of nonprofits and advocacy groups are. And Allison Wilkerson displayed why this is so important. A direct quote from her is, "We're seeing reforms work." And so I kind of took that as just not just a call for hope, but also evidence that when we come together, we can make a difference. Especially as members of the Christian faith, we're really called to this work. And so someone who reads my article might be asking how to get involved, how can we make a difference? But being churches, faith-based organizations, and community members, you can really support this effort by volunteering, providing financial contributions. You can always call your Congress member to really show them how you care about justice-involved youth outcomes. And additionally, as Christians, we are really called to help the justice system and ground it in a vision of morality that really centers children rather than efficiency. So I wanted to end with the Bible verse that I end my article with. It's Proverbs 31:8, and it calls us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute, which really speaks to me and just really shows us what we can do and the difference that we can make.
Yeah, thank you so much, Acacia. I think your article does a beautiful job of not shying away from the harsh realities, but also kind of incorporates just the hope and renewal that you mentioned. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your article. And as Rosalind mentioned, these articles are available on CPJ's website for everyone to take a look at. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rosalind to talk with our second author.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Acacia and Mary Lauren. On a personal note, Acacia was our advocacy intern here at CPJ last summer. So it's so wonderful to see what she's doing now and have her back with us for this webinar. I'd now like to invite Kayan, our other article author, to join me on screen to hear about his article, Irredeemable: Why Juvenile Life Without Parole Fails Our Youth. Kayan, I'm going to ask you some of the same questions, so hopefully you've been thinking a bit about your answers and we can get him up here, hopefully. All right, thank you for bearing with us. Kayan, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself briefly and then tell us a little bit about the topic of your article and what made you interested in writing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, I wanted to thank Center for Public Justice for allowing me to really get involved here and write this article, do this research. And I want to tell a little bit about myself as well. I am a sophomore from American University, and I'm studying CLEG, which is the Communications, Law, Economics, Government. And I was really, really just incredibly excited at the opportunity to be able to speak about an issue that I'm incredibly passionate about. So, in general, juvenile justice is something that I've been really, really interested in for a long time. I have a lot of experience with youth and kind of understanding how opportunities can help one thrive. Thankfully, I've gotten the chance to work as a tutor for much of my young adult life. And thankfully, I've had the opportunity to work as a tutor for much of my young adult life, and it's allowed me to really kind of connect with youth one on one and be able to experience kind of the joy that growing up with resources allows one, kind of the ability that it allows one to thrive, and the way that just this system with juvenile life without parole, which is essentially taking youth with generally Black and brown youth with very little opportunities, essentially giving them no chance at growing and achieving their dreams. It's really been that contrast between kind of being able to see students with my experience tutoring with them really being able to achieve all that they can achieve, and reading about online and through this system all of these youth that don't have those same opportunities and really won't ever be able to get them, and kind of what we can do to be able to help and really make sure that this doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that. Next, I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience of writing the article, maybe something about the topic itself or the process, or just anything you learned from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely my favorite part about this entire process was an interview that I had with Scott Larson, who's the CEO and the president of Straight Ahead Ministries, which is up in Massachusetts. And his organization essentially goes into youth prisons and introduces the gospel and kind of gets those youth who are involved in the criminal justice system involved in service, and kind of prepares them for life outside of the criminal justice system once they're released. And I think what really stuck with me the most talking with Scott was kind of how open and how motivated a lot of these youth are to change, and how grateful they are the opportunity to be able to learn and to thrive. Because really, this sentence, juvenile life without parole, it takes away all of that. It takes away the ability to grow, the ability to change, the ability to benefit yourself and society as well. And really hearing from him about how open some of these young people are to changing, to growing, to maturing, and to helping others was really, really beautiful to hear. And then also kind of just the progress that the US has made with juvenile life without parole. It really started around, I get into in my article, around the 80s and 90s. And then it's gradually, the Supreme Court has really thankfully limited its application, as now more than half of the states have banned it. However, there's still thousands of juveniles serving that sentence, which is a real tragedy.
And, particularly with these bills coming up in Washington, D.C., to see backward progress on that is really disheartening. Lastly, the same question that we gave Acacia, we'd love to hear what you want to make sure people will take away from your article, or the most important thing to communicate about it.
Yeah, I would say mercy. Mercy, and really within the criminal justice system, particularly as it pertains to youth, is the importance of rehabilitation. I know you talked about it with the upcoming legislation in DC, how a lot of it seems to be changing, and I go into a lot in my article as well. Really, the reason that a lot of these harsh sentences don't work on youth is because they can't. And they can't because there's so much research that tells us that it's not possible, that the human brain doesn't stop developing until a person's mid 20s. And there's so much data that suggests really that juveniles have an incredible capacity for change. They really can grow and mature from how they were as kids. And when you think about somebody who's a middle-aged person, the version of themselves that they were as a teenager just doesn't reflect a lot of the same values and drive that they have at a middle stage of a person's life, which is really why these sentences like juvenile life without parole just they don't work. So mercy and rehabilitation as real drivers of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so well put. Thank you so much for sharing, Kane. Kane and Acacia's articles, as well as several others and several more to come, are all available to read online at cpjustice.org/articles, and they are all very worth taking a few minutes to peruse and learn more. Next, I would like to invite my coworker Mary Lauren back on screen to talk about the work she has been doing at CPJ. Mary Lauren joined the Center for Public Justice this past September as part of a 9-month fellowship program that is sadly almost now at an end. During this time, she has worked extensively on researching the funding landscape for faith-based organizations involved in juvenile justice work, and I'm very excited to have her share a bit about that work with you now.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalind, and hello again, everyone. My name is Mary Lauren, and as Rosalind said, I'm the current Juvenile Justice Research Associate at the Center for Public Justice. And over the past 9 months, it's really been a privilege to get a front row seat to how CPJ thinks about public justice in the context of complex policy issues. And so throughout my time at CPJ, and in partnership with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, I've been conducting research on the landscape of funding for faith-based organizations looking to increase capacity in the juvenile justice space. And so before I kind of go over our methodology and explain a bit about that, I just wanted to provide some context on what first motivated this research. And so back in December of 2024, one of my colleagues here at CPJ hosted a listening session for faith-based organizations. We're not actively working in youth justice, but had indicated interest in engaging in juvenile justice issues. Maybe they had a criminal justice portfolio and were looking to extend into juvenile justice, or they focused on some other issue that intersected with juvenile justice, but specifically a lot of their concerns or hesitations for engaging further was around a lack of knowledge of funding opportunities and how to really build capacity and add this to their already existing project portfolios. And so before explaining a little bit more about the methodology, I just wanted to kind of go back to some of the things that Rosalind said to describe why CPJ really sees faith-based organizations, which we define as an organization who's motivated by a faith conviction, as a key stakeholder in juvenile justice work in particular. And so, as we've indicated, juvenile justice is a really complex issue involving individuals across many sectors, including mental health care, community programs, the school system, legal system, social services. It really touches on so many other issues and challenges that youths and families face. And so, as Rosalind was mentioning, faith-based leaders, advocates, and nonprofit organizations are an important stakeholder in juvenile justice work because it's really an opportunity for Christians to practically apply their convictions on the dignity of life, convictions on justice and mercy, the role of the family, caring for the vulnerable, and also a recognition of justice-involved youth as not being, isolated agents, but as really existing within the context of families, provides additional grounding for a Christian framework and focus for engagement in juvenile justice. And so addressing a complex and far-ranging issues such as youth involvement in the justice system requires not only partnerships across sectors, but also partnerships among those operating out of different faith traditions, yet who are united in the pursuit of supporting justice-involved youth. The faith needs of justice-involved youth are often deprioritized, and so faith-based organizations often provide spiritual care in addition to their other programmatic efforts. And so really seeing faith-based organizations and faith leaders as a needed stakeholder and needed voice in this effort is essential to really ensure that the needs of justice-involved youth are holistically met. And so with that kind of framing and context, to kind of better understand the landscape of juvenile justice funding, we talked to some clergy, nonprofit leaders, local and state juvenile justice department officials, and individuals at foundations to kind of understand what existing partnerships looked like and how organizations had kind of navigated the funding landscape. Through these conversations, we gained insight into the particular roles of faith-based advocates and service providers in the juvenile justice space. We heard about funder perceptions of faith-based organizations. I think that from the listening session and just through other conversations, that was a hesitancy of how do foundations perceive faith-based organizations? And so we gained some insights into that. We also learned about the current capacity of organizations to engage in juvenile justice work and kind of areas they were looking to expand in. And we also gained some insights on how individuals thought about communicating their standing as a faith-based organization to their work. So just as we talked about the framework that CPJ uses to kind of connect our faith convictions to the work that we're doing, it was neat to hear from other organizations how they communicate that connection as well. We also learned about the process of identifying funding sources and barriers that faith-based organizations experience, as well as strategies to address those barriers. And so integrating those findings with expertise from some CPJ staff led to, or still in the process, but is leading to the main deliverable for this project, which is a toolkit. And so just to provide kind of a top level overview on some of these insights, we heard many stories of some really strong partnerships between faith-based organizations and local county and government school systems. And these partnerships took the form of both financial partnerships and relational partnerships, such as information sharing. And I think that just hearing those stories, some of which will be shared in the toolkit, I think are, just really helpful for kind of understanding the ways that faith-based organizations can partner with organizations in other sectors to really support justice-involved youth. In terms of funding and capacity building, we learned that the most successful grant opportunities for faith-based organizations appear to be at the local level, and local funding sources like community foundations recognize that faith-based organizations in particular bring a more kind of ears to the ground perspective, often due to their deep connections to their particular community and emphasis on storytelling as a means of engagement. And so I think that was really encouraging to hear that foundations that either do or do not have a faith portfolio recognize the value that faith-based organizations bring in addressing the needs of a community. And then additionally, nearly all faith-based organizations that we spoke to saw churches as critical to their engagement model. And so strengthening partnerships with congregations and houses of worship were critical for building capacity. And so as I mentioned, these interviews form the basis for the primary deliverable for this project, which is a website landing page designed to provide resources and insights for faith-based organizations and faith leaders who are looking to increase capacity and engagement in the juvenile justice sphere. And as I mentioned, this website integrates expertise from CPJ staff with some kind of broad level synthesized findings from our interview conversations. And so just to kind of walk through what you can expect in this toolkit, first is pathways of engagement. And so this section will provide a framework to consider faith-based involvement in the juvenile justice sphere, along with resources on how to engage churches, think about relational partnerships, and tell stories surrounding juvenile or justice-involved youth in an authentic, transparent, and respectful manner. So that's kind of focused on more of those like relational means of engagement. Another part of the toolkit that I'm really excited about is an interactive appendix. And so this will be sort of a resource bank of faith-based organizations that are currently doing juvenile justice work that are kind of distinguished by type. So whether it's chaplaincy services, mental health services, an advocacy organization, a mentoring organization, and kind of the idea is that this could serve as a way for organizations to connect and see what other organizations might exist in their area and share resources. And so, really excited about this portion of the toolkit. The third main section of the landing page will be dedicated to insights and strategies to approach funding sources, both thinking about what it looks like to navigate funding from private foundations, local foundations, as well as government funding. I think a big misconception is that faith-based organizations cannot receive government funding, but there's actually some legislation that has paved the way for that. And so excited to kind of highlight ways that faith-based organizations can increase their capacity by applying to grants. And then finally, going back to what I was mentioning a little bit ago, in efforts to showcase stories of faith-based organizations who have navigated the funding landscape, and we're excited to highlight several of CPJ's partners in this toolkit. And these spotlights will share insights on a number of topics, including building a diverse funding stream, maintaining faith convictions while also developing a kind of far-ranging partnership base. So really excited to include some stories from organizations that are doing really faithful work and really seeking to address the needs of justice-involved youth. And so this website landing page is expected to launch sometime this summer. If you're on this call and you're a faith leader or someone at a faith-based organization, we really hope that this landing page will be helpful, accessible, and informative for deepening involvement in the juvenile justice space. I think Rosalind's going to provide a little bit more information at the end about how you can stay connected to CPJ, but signing up for our family and caregiving policy newsletter is a great way to stay up to date, especially because it'll be announced there whenever this landing page is launched. And so with that, it's been a joy to get to work at CPJ on this project, and I'm really excited for the ways that it's coming together. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Rosalind for some concluding remarks.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary Lauren. This research project, as I said, has been in the works for 9 months, so it's very exciting to be able to share it with all of you and take it to its next level. And we are just so grateful to Mary Lauren for all of the amazing work she has put in on this project. We truly couldn't have done it without her. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon for our webinar. I hope this has been a fruitful opportunity to learn more and engage with this topic. A big thank you to Mary Lauren again, our article writers, Acacia and Kayan, for joining us, the CPJ Comms team who makes these events possible, and our Director of Family and Caregiving Policy, Maddie Allen. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our funding partner, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, without whom we wouldn't be able to host these webinars and have these important conversations. So we will be putting in the chat, and I think we may already have as well, the link to sign up for CPJ's newsletters. We encourage you to sign up for ours, the Family and Caregiving Policy newsletter, as well as any others. And we'll also be making available the link to access the resources we discussed today, as well as the engagement packet, all of which will also be in a follow-up email. And I think Mary Lauren is going to close us in prayer. Thank you all so much.
All right, please join me in prayer. Dear God, thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about youth justice policy. Thank you for everyone who attended the convening today and for all those who made the event possible. We ask that you would be with them and guide their paths forward. God, we pray for all the young people that are caught up in a broken justice system. We pray for their health, safety, and the promise of their futures. Thank you for caring about these vulnerable young people and for entrusting them into our care. It is in your name we pray. Amen.